Hello everyone, we are today here at the Tank Museum Bovington and we look at the Pak 43/41. Now why is the /41 important? Well, the original Pak 43 was intended to be mounted on a cross mount, like the Flak 88.
Luckily, I found several experience reports in the German military archives that will be discussed later. First, some general information about this gun and its brother. The regular Pak 43 had a cross mount, as you can see here, not spades like the regular German anti-tank guns. Here you can see how it looks limbered up. Yet due to production issues, the regular mount with wheels was selected. This came with serious drawbacks. The combat weight increased from 3,650 kg by 700 kg to about 4,350 kg. The height of the gun increased from 1.73 to 1.9 meters, while the horizontal traverse decreased from 360 to 30 degree according to Fleischer, but Hogg and Kozar note 56 degree. In any way, this was less than the 75mm Pak 40 with its 65 degree horizontal traverse, that also only weighed about 1,425 kg. This was not a theoretical problem, since due to the enormous weight of the Pak 43/41, it was very cumbersome. This was particularly a problem during infantry attacks, as noted in the bulletin of the Panzerwaffe. The total crew of the Pak 43/41 was 9 men, 1 leader and 8 regular men. A report particularly notes that these were all required due to the weight and that reserves should be available in case of losses. Both guns had different breaches, yet in terms of armor penetration there was no difference. So let us look at the penetration values. Fleischer gives the following data. For the Panzergranate 39/1 at an angle of 30 degree, 185mm at 500 meters range, 165mm at 1000 meters range, 132mm at 2000 meter range. For the Panzergranate 40/43W, which had no explosive filler, the penetration values at 30 degree were as follows. 270mm at 500 meter range, 179mm at 1000 meter range, 152mm at 2000 meter range, which meant that any medium tank could be penetrated from the front at the range of 2000 meters or even beyond. But what about heavy tanks? An IS-2 1944 from the front was only vulnerable to the Panzergranate 40/43 at 500 meters range. The Sherman M4A3E2 Jumbo with 102mm or 4 inches frontal armor would be vulnerable to a regular Panzergranate at 1000 meters or below. The Königstiger would theoretically be impenetrable from the front, but due to German armor quality being rather low at that point, in practice the result might be quite different. So at a range of 2000 meters, those tanks should be safe from the front, whereas the Jumbo with 4 inches frontal armor would be already vulnerable at 1000 meters. Anyway, let us take a short look at the Pak 43/41 and its parts. As you can see, it has a huge barrel. This is not the 80mm gun from the Tiger I with a length of 56 times the caliber, but 71 times. So the same barrel length as for the Königstiger, the Jagdpanther and the Hornisse. Technically the gun had a maximum range of 15 kilometers, but the effective range against tanks was up to 2 kilometers according to the regulation for the regular Pak 43 that used the same gun. Here you can see the large trail spades. The spades were the same as that of the Leichte Feldhaubitze 18, the 105mm light howitzer, whereas the wheels were the same as that of the 150mm heavy field howitzer. Note that the trail spades are in traveling position. If the gun was in firing positions, these would be spread out and the spikes dug into the earth to prevent the gun from moving backwards during firing. Of course, in this case, the gun would be very limited in its mobility. Like other German anti-tank guns, the gun shield consists of 2 plates, both had a thickness of 4.5mm, so it only protected against small arms fire and fragments. Behind the gun shield on the left, there's a gun sight with the range knob. The sight on top of it is a Rundblickfernrohr, a panoramic telescope, which is generally used for indirect fire. Below you can see 2 cranks. The left is for changing the gun depression, the right crank is for changing the traverse of the gun. If we look at the evolution of the German anti-tank gun in World War II, the aspect that increased the most was not the caliber, but the weight. The 37mm pack started out with a combat weight of 450 kg. This value was more than doubled with the 50mm pack 38 at 950 kg. The next in line was the 75mm pack 40 with 1425 kg. So the increase was only about 50% in weight. But for the pack 43/41, the combat weight basically tripled with 4350 kg. Now keep in mind that already for the 75mm pack 40, the weight was already a major issue. To quote the regulation, the large weight of the gun permits movement in tow by crew only over the shortest possible distance under favorable ground conditions. So how was the pack 43/41 moved? According to Fleischer and the 1944 report, the German half-track Sonderkraftfahrzeug 6 and 7 should be used. Alternatively, the Maultier, which was a truck converted into a half-track, could also be used. And as you can see, these half-tracks are also not that small either. Yet using them to move the pack was not really a possibility during combat. A report from 1944 particularly notes that changing positions is not possible since these vehicles are very vulnerable. As such, it is not surprising that the pack 43/41 should be replaced in the long run. A report from January 1944 about the armament production noted it should be replaced with a self-propelled gun, in parentheses, Waffenträger, weapon carrier. Although it is important to add that on the same page it is also noted that the most important German anti-tank gun of the war, the 75mm pack 40, should also be replaced with the Sturmgeschütz 38T, later called Jagdpanther 38 and generally known as the Hetzer. Needless to say, this wasn't achieved for either of these two guns. Let us look at the experience reports next. And luckily I found several in the German military archives for summer 1943 and February 1944. The contrast between these reports is very interesting. Let us start with the 1943 reports. Overall, these are rather positive. The second report notes that the gun performed better than suspected. The first report notes that it is very important to provide proper radios for the platoons so that the company leader can properly coordinate due to the long ranges. Furthermore, for each platoon there should be a Verbindungsmann, a liaison, so a contact with the infantry at the first line, particularly to inform if the infantry moves backwards and disengages from the enemy. It is particularly noted that the coordination between the infantry and the anti-tank units must be even stronger than before. It is stated that the grenadiers and the anti-tank men must create a close-knit fighting community, verschworene Kampfgemeinschaft. Only such a community based on trust provides success. About positioning, the first report states that the positions were generally imposed by the enemy and scouting them was generally not possible. Similarly, the second report notes that the guns were generally used in improvised positions and not in prepared ones. The first report continues that the gun should be positioned in such a way that the range is not above 2.4 kilometers, which is above the value of 2 kilometers provided in the manual. If it's possible, the guns should be positioned so that they can flank the enemy from two sides. Since if the enemy tank attack is engaged from two flanks at once, this results in some tanks just stopping, others increasing the speed, where some turn around and head back. What's very interesting is, when creating a firing position, foxholes for the individual riflemen should be dug out first. In contrast to training, where the creation of the firing position of the gun is prioritized. The reason is given as well. Combat experience has shown that there was never enough time to create a position for the whole gun so far. Additionally, they note that alternate positions are very important due to enemy artillery, particularly noting that not tanks but artillery and infantry are the biggest threat or main enemy of the anti-tank gun. Adding that the battalion lost 5 guns due to direct hits from artillery and only 1 gun through hits from enemy tanks. Artillery gets an additional paragraph. The report states that the concentrated artillery fire into the positions can limit the visibility and observation capabilities of the gun crews. mentioning a particular case where the gun positions were overrun by 30 to 40 tanks, while only 6 T-34s could be destroyed. As such, 5 guns with towing vehicles were lost. It is suggested that guns with some distances in overwatch positions on the flanks provide cover. In terms of requirements for the crew, the report states that the best gunner is basically just good enough for the PaK 43/41. For the overall crew, it must be in excellent physical shape and in terms of morale as well. The driver of the towing vehicle is discussed in the most detail. He requires at least some tactical understanding, and intensive training for the driver in terms of determining the terrain is suggested. For instance, how to recover a gun from a position in a way that the enemy sees the vehicle as briefly as possible. Finally, it is noted that merely training someone to be a good driver is just not good enough. In terms of crew, it's particularly noted that the full crew is necessary due to the large weight of the gun. The full crew is required for proper turning of the gun and also limbering. And even with a full crew, if the ground was wet, it was difficult to turn the gun. As such, it is requested that each company has reserves available. It is added that currently the battalion used versprengte Infanteristen, scattered riflemen, for this purpose. In terms of gun performance, it is noted that there were sometimes issues that the casings were not fully ejected. In regard to the accuracy, that they did not note a strong dispersion above 2 km range, but that it is also rare that targets are engaged above that range. This is in contrast to the second report. It notes that the range and accuracy are very high and that in rare cases they even hit tanks at the range of 5 km. Yet they only achieved this by adding estimated indicators to the range indicator. The first report noted that in order to prevent jams, the rifleman which hands the ammunition to the loader must have a piece of cloth to clean the shell. In the second report, I did not find anything about this issue. Furthermore, it is very important that several men are trained to sight the gun under field conditions. There is no explanation given, yet the second report notes that after combat repositioning and marches, it was noted that the guns were often not properly sighted anymore. As a final remark, the first report states that they had relatively high losses, yet that generally the gun is seen as the best and most suited anti-tank weapon available. For the second report, it is noted keeping the gun at the main line of resistance seems to be not a good idea, because it's hard to camouflage and it will attract artillery fire, and as such it should only be used at a certain distance from the main line of resistance and only for a short while. Let us look at the February 1944 reports next. These are far more negative about the overall viability of the gun. In this case, we also have a report from a Panzer army, whereas the other reports are from battalions. The report of the Panzer army notes that the gun faces high losses due to enemy artillery preparations, even before it can give a single shot at an enemy tank. As such, they suggest putting the positions far in the rear and also to use the long range of the gun. The report provides losses of 2 battalions and note that the losses in comparison to destroyed tanks is rather limited, and in some cases that the guns were captured by the enemy as well. They particularly note that these numbers show the extraordinary vulnerability of the PaK 43/41, noting that the enemy will easily detect even if the gun is well camouflaged. Usually guns receive substantial losses during artillery preparations, and even if it's not totally lost, it is usually damaged. Also, a regular repositioning of the gun is not possible since generally there are not enough troops to create several alternate positions, and even if this is possible, it's not possible to reposition the gun during daylight if the enemy is firing. Furthermore, if the enemy suspects the gun, he keeps his tanks out of range. Generally, if the artillery preparation is over, the enemy starts with a large infantry attack, which comes from all sides, but due to the limited horizontal traverse, is a major problem for the gun. The report adds that the PaK 43 with cross-mount would provide some relief, but it does not help for the towing vehicle, which has to be kept nearby. Particularly in regard to defending against infantry, it is noted that the amount of high explosive ammunition is never enough for hour-long battles against the enemy infantry. It is added that in a period of 8 days of fighting, 4 ammunition vehicles were lost. Note those vehicles like the mentioned RSO and Maultier were generally not armored. The report states that 4 questions become apparent, namely, first, if the guidelines of the pamphlet for the employment are outdated. Second, if it makes sense to continue the production of the PAK 43/41. Third, if the PAK 43 with the cross mount can be considered a solution to the existing problems. Fourth, if there is, regardless of the production situation, an alternative solution. The answers were as follows. To number 1, yes. Note that in April 1944 additional guidelines were released that specifically addressed the employment of the gun outside prepared positions. Second, no. Third, no. And for fourth, increased production of Hornissen, which was later called Nashorn, which was a self-propelled gun with an 88mm gun with the same performance. Here you can see the Nashorn of the restoration project by the volunteers. Be sure to check out the channel and their crowdfunding campaign. Note that the Nashorn has the same chassis as the Hummel self-propelled artillery, which used a 150mm artillery gun, which I covered previously on my channel. Attached to the Panzer Army report was a report from a heavy anti-tank battalion, which notes that the Soviet artillery tactics in preparation often fired positions in depth that often reaches 2 to 3 kilometers. After this preparation, the enemy primarily attacks with infantry first. As such, if the anti-tank guns are not destroyed during the artillery fire, they must face infantry, and in such a combat, the gun is often outmaneuvered and destroyed in close combat, which resulted in situations that this anti-tank gun could not be used against tanks at all. To summarize, although the PAK 43/41 had a long range, high accuracy and high penetration values, it was a cumbersome gun. The gun could be effective if it could be used against enemy tank attacks, but as reports suggest, the Soviets by use of artillery fire and infantry attacks basically made the gun mostly ineffective. Thank you to the Tank Museum at Bovington for inviting me, thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script, thank you for watching and see you next time.